it's great to do this. Yasmin had, in her usual entrepreneurial fashion, assigned roles to everybody, and the role she gave me was discussing wealth creation. I wasn't entirely sure that this was the right role for a lawyer, so I basically invented my own topic. And what I've decided to do is discuss wealth creation, but from the perspective of a lawyer. And of course, there's a bit of a pause here. How many people in the room are lawyers? I can only see 2 hands. Fascinating. So that tells you something, doesn't it? Lawyers don't think of themselves as entrepreneurs. Actually, many people don't think of lawyers as entrepreneurs. And that's actually quite striking, because we're in an environment where really everybody ought to be an entrepreneur. And so my focus today is basically to say to all of you, there may be areas in which you're operating or that you're thinking about where you actually don't think they can be businesses or be entrepreneurial in any sense of the word. This isn't true, and it's something you need to think about. And the reason you need to think about it is because Ghana, like any other country in the world, has to build on the strength of the entrepreneurial base that we create. Everybody in this country has an ability to add to our GDP in all sorts of different ways. And unless we recognize this and build on it, we will continue to have what I'd suggest is a bit of a problem. So everybody here, all of you came because you wanted to hear about entrepreneurship. All of you probably are entrepreneurs already. But what I'm suggesting to you is building on the suggestions of Tony, who spoke a little while ago, that there may be things you're not thinking about that could develop into businesses. And this is something that you really ought to focus on. Okay, I had done a few slides, nothing very fancy, just to sort of remind myself of what it was I wanted to focus on. And the first answer to the question of wealth creation in this respect, as I've said, is entrepreneurship. That's what we need to be doing. We know that high levels of unemployment can stall our economic development. We know that the creation of new businesses, the invention of new goods and services are all ways of expanding our markets, of employing people, of giving people things to do, and indeed of creating social change. So it's something that's particularly important for our country, and it's something that we really, really, as I said, need to give some thought to. So lawyers as entrepreneurs, really? Most people are like, what are you talking about? Lawyers are risk averse, they're cautious, they're careful, they're constantly giving you warnings and caveats and telling you you can't do this and you can't do that and you mustn't do this and you mustn't do that. So can a lawyer really be entrepreneurial? I think we can. And I'm going to focus just on one aspect of being a lawyer. In some respects, advising businesses, advising entrepreneurs requires you to have an entrepreneurial mindset, because otherwise you don't understand what your clients are doing. But I'm actually going to focus on the issue of lawyers setting up and running their businesses, because in that respect, they are true entrepreneurs. They are building a business, they are trying to make profits, they are doing everything any other businessman would do, or woman in this case. And my apologies for saying man, because really I'm looking around and what's the balance? Are there more women than men? We haven't, well, we'll figure that one out later. But I'm using men neutrally, just to say that. So, establishing a law practice as an enterprise and not as a vocation. Think of a law firm as a business. Think of the lawyers who set them up as entrepreneurs. So, how are we defining an entrepreneur? And this is why I want us to think about this. It's an individual, usually, or a couple of individuals, who start and run a business, often with limited resources, often with relatively limited planning, because they really don't know exactly what it is they want to do. They have to deal with financial issues, they have to deal with management problems, they have to deal with marketing failures, and they have to learn from all of these. They try to take account of all the risks that they know they're going to face, and they hope for a reasonable return. So in co-founding and growing my law firm, for example, as an enterprise, it was obvious to me that I and my co-founder were indeed entrepreneurs, although many people wouldn't have thought of us as that. So why is that important? It's important, as I've alluded to already, because it means that there may be many more people out there who aren't thinking of themselves as entrepreneurs, who therefore aren't defining their businesses in an entrepreneurial way, who are not focused on the bottom line, who are not understanding what it is they need to do to make their businesses grow. It's also important because if there are that many entrepreneurs out there, then we need to question whether our government is taking them seriously. And I'll say governments because it could be any of the governments that we may have now or in the future. How seriously are those governments being taken? We had a little discussion a while ago about policy issues. And you must remember that the government sets policies, and what they do can make such a difference to how an entrepreneur creates their business, that it's a vital consideration that one should always bear in mind. And if our governments aren't taking entrepreneurs seriously, then we have to ask whether or not they're providing the correct ecosystem for the entrepreneurs. Do we think so? All of us sitting here? Do we feel frustrated by bureaucracy? Are we struggling with regulations that don't make sense? Are we paying for things that should probably cost about half of what they cost? These are all questions that we ought to be asking, and questions that we ought to be putting to our government, and questions that we ought to be, as with Dr. Otenjesi, forming ourselves into associations, thinking about, making constructive suggestions to our governments and asking them to be responsible to us, the citizens of this country, because we need to grow. So all of these are things that we need to think about. Now, often we discuss entrepreneurial success on certain broad themes, and I've suggested 6 of them. I've suggested to you that you don't get sufficient support, in my view, for all the things that you want to do. And this isn't to say that you can't be successful. We have very successful entrepreneurs in this room. But I'm one of those who believes that God helps those who help themselves. So I feel that all actual or prospective entrepreneurs have a responsibility both to themselves and to their country to make sure that they are building strong and sustainable enterprises. And in that context, some of these themes are extremely important. And I thought I'd discuss this by sharing some aspects of my entrepreneurial journey. As I said, I was the co-founder of a law firm. We started as a 2-person law firm. Currently, we have 54 lawyers and 9 partners. And this has been, thank you, over the space of about 30 years. It's doable. It was painful. We learned a lot of lessons on the way. Luckily, we didn't completely fail, but we certainly had a few very hard times. So let me discuss what for us was the first item, identifying the opportunity. The question for us was there really a viable business opportunity in our prospective market? Now, remember, I was building a firm 30 years ago when the model for a law practice was very different from the practices that we probably see more generally nowadays. Much more traditional, generally sole practitioner, possibly two, went to court in the morning, did a little bit of work in the afternoon, slept in between. We wanted to build a law practice that was much more of a business-oriented law practice. It was something that was developing internationally, and for us, the question was whether or not this would work in the Nigerian market. Would clients use a firm like ours? That was a question that we had to address. Would they be willing to buy legal services from a business rather than from a person? So we weren't doing anything particularly innovative, but we were trying a model that had worked elsewhere in our market. And that, again, is a suggestion that all of you can take up. Are there things that have been done elsewhere that you can do here and build upon? Every country has a culture that is different from the other. So there'll be different things that you need to take into consideration, but you can certainly take ideas and expand them. So we were setting up a business. We were therefore going to be a little bit less personal than might otherwise be the case. We were thinking of, making money. We really needed to make sure that we had all our costs covered. Our billing practices were going to be different. We weren't going to be accepting chickens or goats or land. We actually needed cash. So this really was a little bit different than things that had happened in the previous times. We also wanted to set ourselves up as an institution. We wanted something that would last beyond us. The firm happens to be called Udoma and Belo-Osagie, but most people actually don't call it that anymore. You find that increasingly it's becoming called UUBO. And part of the reason for that is that we now have a lot of partners who are gently edging the founding partners out. They're going to take it over, to be expected. And we're beginning to realize that it's good to have possibly a slightly more neutral name. So it's something that we are very conscious of, something that we accept, something that we are adapting our business to accept. But that was very much in our minds at the time that we set the business up. We didn't start with any data or market research. There really wasn't any information out there that we could rely on. So for us, we basically just had to go with our gut. And we took the view that in a country where there were an increasing number of businesses being set up, it was likely that people who were businesses themselves would appreciate the services of a business law firm like ours. And that was the basis on which we set up. We set ourselves up as a business law firm that was trying to provide legal services to the business community. It wasn't a great leap of faith. There were people who were beginning to do things that were similar, but nobody had quite structured it in the way we were thinking of. But what was interesting was that it was clear that that trend was becoming fashionable. At the time we set up, there were probably 2 other law firms that set up pretty much about the same time as ourselves. We've luckily remained as a partnership, and it's one of our, I think, bragging points that we believe we chose the right partners right from the beginning, and we have continued to do so, and therefore we have developed as a single institution. So it's very helpful if one can, if you're taking on partners from the beginning, think through whether or not you do have the same ideas, values, intentions. Do you think about money the same way? Are you prepared to invest? We heard all about putting money back into a business. It's not always easy. All of you know that. Somebody comes in, I need to do X and I need to do Y, and you are saying, no, but we have to buy, at least in our case in those days, a computer. That was big money at the time. And it was like, but there's a typewriter, can't you just kind of manage with that for the time being? And you're sort of saying, no, we need to move on. We need to make ourselves relevant. We need to show ourselves as able to meet our customers in their technological space. We need to show that we have the ability to move with the times. These were all considerations that we had to bear in mind. So, we then had to assess what our risks were. I've kind of alluded to them. We were practicing law in a less than traditional manner. We weren't sure whether our clients would actually use us. But in addition to that, we had to decide whether or not we would be able to get lawyers to work with us. Because when you have a model where lawyers work for a while and then move on and set up their own practices, to be saying to them, well, we'd actually like you to stay and help us to grow this practice together, and you will be able to grow within the practice and eventually make partner. Not everybody was convinced by this. So it was a little bit of a risk for us as well. We had to decide whether or not this model might mean that we ended up at 70, still doing a lot of the work. Luckily, that isn't the case. As I said, we're being pushed out and we haven't quite got to 70. So I think the model has worked well. But we had to figure out as entrepreneurs how to mitigate those risks. And these were just two, I think, of the many risks that we faced, but I'll focus on these. So, as I said, we focused on the business community because our views were that that category of client would understand the way we were doing business, whether they were local or foreign. And we reduced the risk that we wouldn't be able to sell our legal services by also focusing primarily on corporate businesses. So we dimensioned our market in a way that we thought would suit us. All of these are business practices that I think all of you recognize. And if you don't, then I certainly hope that it's something that you will take away from this discussion. We next had to figure out how to manage the money. Now, generally lawyers are not particularly mathematical. Certainly I was pretty useless. Luckily I had a partner who was actually quite a good mathematician. He certainly understood numbers well, and he could do some pretty basic bookkeeping, so that worked extremely well for me. But we had to deal with the issue first of financial management. Where were we going to raise the funds to set this business off? Like many of you in this room, I'm sure you approached friends, you approached family. In his case, he had worked before, so he had some savings, but I didn't. I was coming out of school, and I had to, that's not quite the right way to put it. My husband gave me what I deem an interest-free loan, since I've never paid it back, and he has never asked me for it. And so that loan remains in place, and maybe one day he will actually do so. But that was the basis on which we began. Now, obviously, financial management meant not only that we should sort of try and raise as much money as possible to not only get the business going, but keep it going for a certain period of time until we could be sure that we would actually earn some revenue. So we had to try and understand roughly how much that would be. Could we survive for 3 months? Could we survive for 6 months if nobody employed our services? That was a decision we had to make. So raising the appropriate amount of money required a little bit of thought on our part. Having raised that money, we needed to conserve it. We needed to try and make sure that we managed our cash flow. In our case, we decided to essentially operate a cash business. If there was no cash in the bank, we didn't have money. That was the way we did it. We weren't thinking about accrual accounting, any of these wonderfully fancy things. Our simple mantra was that get the money, put it in the bank. If it's there, we've got it. And that, of course, meant that a lot of our time was spent making sure that we actually got paid. Again, all of you, I'm sure, go through this. You have these products, you have these services, you're selling them into the market. 45 days passes by, 90 days passes by, there's a story, there's a long story. It's a struggle. How do you make sure you can get yourself paid? And I have to say that if you have somebody who has the ability to charm money out of people, that's a great entrepreneurial skill, and you should hold that person close to you. So, managing our money, we learned to do that. As I said, we decided very deliberately to operate on the basis of cash. But then we also had to generate revenue. And that, for me, was the dreaded thing of, as we call it in the legal services industry, business development. In other words, marketing. How do you sell yourself? The question was asked. How do you make people feel that you are worth the money that they are going to pay for you? Quality is obviously a major thing. And, far too often, I think in Ghana, as much as in Nigeria, you're kind of told, oh, manage it, it doesn't matter. Somebody's written something, it's grammatically incorrect, it's illogical, it's badly written. I don't see why one should manage that. Our view was, as lawyers, we were meant to communicate clearly advice that was not just legally sound, but also commercially useful. Remember, we were dealing with a business environment. We weren't going to be writing 30-page treatises on, the value of X, Y, or Z as a legal proposition. We needed to give advice that our clients could just take and use. That was what we felt was our unique selling product, or at least what we sought to make our unique selling product. Again, that's something that each and every one of you will understand. How do you differentiate yourself? Why will people come to you rather than to anybody else? So learning to market ourselves was a bit of a struggle, but we learned to do it. And I have to tell you that one of my least favorite times was when I had to run the firm in the absence of my partner. He was a good husband. His wife went to France to work, and he decided that he would go with her. And he went and got a job in France, leaving me, a foreigner, in charge of this organization, which was no longer just the two of us. We now had people on our payroll. So my panic was, is this man going to come back from France and find a dead business? Or am I going to make sure that that business continues so that when he comes back, he can just open his office and step back in? And I remember going to one of the offices of something called the BPE, which was the privatization agency of Nigeria at the time, and walking into somebody's office who was handling a particular bid for legal services, and introducing myself, sitting down. So he looks at me, looks at my card, looks at me and says, Belo-Osagie, are you the wife of... And he calls my husband's name, and I said, yes. So he throws the card back at me and says, I don't understand this, you women. 1. 2, are you suggesting your husband can't look after you? I beg, move and let people who need the money get the business. So, what do? You sort of had to try and appear calm and collected instead of screaming. And I basically said to him, well, think about it. I employ 4 people at the time. I need to pay their salaries. The fact that you think that I don't need the money doesn't mean that I have money to give them if I don't earn it from this business. Don't you think you should support me? Sort of sulky, maybe look. Then I said to him, but you have daughters, I think. I happen to know that he did. And I said, so if you had paid all that money for their school fees and they had trained to be lawyers and somebody did not let them practice their profession, what would you do? That made him a little bit more sympathetic. He didn't give me the business, but at least I was on the next list. So I regarded that as a success. So generating revenue by marketing. As I said, for us, we felt it was quality. We were not the best at doing the kind of marketing that many people do, networking, conferences, that sort of thing. For us, we felt our work should speak for us. We were prepared to speak at conferences and so on and so forth, but we didn't think we should just attend. We tried to focus on what we felt were our strengths and abilities. We're not great socializers, we don't go out and about, so what were we going to do that we thought we could do and do well? That's what we had to determine and try and focus on in order to generate revenue. The next thing that all of you will also have dealt with is, so you've built up this little organization. How do you manage it? Who should your first employees be? And after that, are you running it with the right people? We decided actually that our first employees should not be lawyers. Our very first employee was a driver. And the reason for that, of course, was that at the time in Nigeria, the traffic was terrible. You couldn't get anywhere. To pay bills and so on and so forth could take you half a day. Getting a telephone line sorted out could take another half of the day. I mean, there were so many things that could waste your time. So we needed somebody who could run around. That was much more important to us than getting a lawyer. Then the next employee we got was a secretary who also functioned as our receptionist, same story, many things. Our legal clerk, he was the person who went to the bank, and in those days when you went to the bank, and it's fascinating actually when you think of how much has changed now, but you'd go to the bank and you'd give them something called a teller. And you'd be in the bank for 3 hours while they decided whether or not this teller number was going to be called. And if you were lucky and it was called, then you could go up and cash your check. And if it wasn't, at the end of the day, you kind of went away and came back. It was terrible. So, the joys of technology today really strike me. But these were the things that we thought we needed to avoid. We needed to actually focus on what we thought we could do best. So our first employees and our first priority were people who could take some of this away from us. Again, something that all of you will have thought about. Sometimes you're doing more than you need to do. Sometimes you need to hive off things that are not vital for getting your business going. You have to make that decision. You then have to make the decision as you're employing people. Are you employing the right people? Not just to do any additional work that has been created, but also to run your organization for you. It was interesting, the driver that we had, first of all, he stayed with us for, I think he's still with us actually. He's been with us for over 30 years, and he kind of developed into the chief driver, managing what was essentially our transport department of about 6 cars and 2 motorcycles. So he kind of have. So, managing the enterprise. Then our next issue was planning for problems. And we're lawyers. We try and think of everything. What could go wrong? What could go right? So what if this? What if that? Of course you can't plan for everything, but at least you have to think about it. You have to decide whether or not, should circumstances change, you're going to be able to continue doing business. The thing that struck me was a time when we lost something like 30% of our business. We had developed into a very strong banking and finance firm. It was something that generated quite a large portion of our revenue. And my husband happened to become chairman of a bank. So all the other banks decided that our firm must of necessity be conflicted, because my husband was chairman of a bank, that information would leak from our law firm and go into his bank. And so we lost a lot of our work, we lost a lot of our mandates, and we therefore had to sit down and think, how do we survive? We can't lose effectively 40% of our income and not be concerned about this. We needed to replace that. Being lawyers, we did have options. You think of other areas of the law, you generate clients in that industry, in the banking and finance industry, who are non-Nigerian. These were things that we could do. And I won't say to you that these were things we thought about as we set up the firm, but I think instinctively we knew that there was something that we could replace lost business with. But it is, again, something that each and every entrepreneur needs to think about. So if I'm producing this and the market dies, I can shut down the firm, of course, and move into something else. But is there another way I can use these products? We were listening to the discussion about nano ice. I thought that was really interesting because in a way that's sort of what they're doing. Not that the market shut down, but at least they're looking for different opportunities. And it's something that each and every person should be doing. When you begin a business, you begin it thinking of one thing. But if you develop the ability to think of it in several different ways, I think it becomes increasingly useful to you. And it's something that you should very deliberately consider. I think the last thing I always think about is, so what's the plan B? Do you know when you have to exit? If you're not generating any revenue, if you have no customers, if things are terrible, obviously you probably will shut down and exit. But as I suggested, maybe there are other options. Maybe there are other things you can do with the business you have set up, with the organization you have created. But it's something that one must give very deliberate thought to. Our exit plan as lawyers was, well, we'll go and work in another law firm, or in my case, I had the option of going to teach. But it's something that not everybody thinks about. And it's very striking to me when we provide advice to entrepreneurs and you say to them, okay, so let's assume this doesn't work. What are you thinking about doing? And there's this look of, no, God is on my side. As I said, God helps those who help themselves, and I think that at least it's something you need to think about. So again, it's something I would encourage all of you to do. So back to my original point. There are entrepreneurial possibilities in all sorts of strange places. There are things that each and every one of you can think about. All of you have the ability to generate businesses that will grow, and these things are truly important for our country because we have a young country, many young people who are going to be needing jobs in the near future. And to the extent that each and every one of us can support that particular thing, it's really important. I wish you all the best.